Well, one thing I always notice around October and Halloween season, if you have the TV on, they always have all these horror movies on, during Halloween season. And I don't know about you, I've never really been real big into horror movies. Just never been a huge fan. And that wasn't always the case. Actually, I saw my first, real horror movie when I was in college. So it was all the way when I was in college that I saw my first horror movie. And it's interesting because my friends were like, I can't believe you never saw a horror movie. You got to see one. And they told me one to go see. And I'm not going to tell you the one that I saw, that I rented and saw. I'll just suffice to say, it's one of those that gives you a lot of nightmares. And I'll just leave it at that. But anyway, I remember I rented this movie, and I made a bad mistake when I watched this horror movie. In addition to just watching a horror movie, but I made a bad mistake in that I decided at our apartment, my roommate went home for the weekend, and I was by myself on a Friday night, and I decided to watch the movie. And the movie, it was scary. But what made it even worse was after the movie was done, and I turned the movie off, and I'm sitting there, all of a sudden, have you ever felt like this? You start to get overwhelmed, and you start to hear every little squeak, and every little creak of everything. And our apartment was in this old house, and I'm always like, turn around. What was that? Oh no! I flicked on all the lights in the apartment and everything, and I'm just sitting there petrified. I tried to put on sports on TV to get my mind off it. That didn't work. So then I'm like, I have to sleep. And every time I tried to sleep, I would open my eyes again. I'd be like, I can't. I'm not going to do that. So I lay there with my blanket up to my eyes. And just been like, I can't deal with this. And you're just overwhelmed, and you're kind of frozen, and just you're kind of at your end. Have you ever been in a situation like that? I mean, maybe it's not watching a horror movie, but just in real life, sometimes we face real life, and things can kind of flood into our lives, and we feel overwhelmed. We feel scared, or we feel, just really uneasy or worried. And maybe it's things that overwhelm us in life that just keep coming at us. If you've ever experienced like financial things that just keep coming. And the hits keep coming, and the hits keep coming, and you think you finally get ahead, and it doesn't, and it just seems to never end. Or maybe it's a health issue you're dealing with, and it just pops up, and you're just like, when will this end? I don't know what to do, and you start to get afraid, and you start to get overwhelmed. And this kind of stress and this kind of fear, it's the kind of stress and fear that can keep us up nights, can't it? Have you ever been up nights with things like that, and make us feel kind of desperate, and just like, I gotta find some way of getting through this? Well, this is where we find God's people this morning. God's people, the Israelites, who are pressed into slavery in Egypt, as we pick up our journey through Exodus this morning and following a faithful God. So this morning we're in Exodus chapter 2. So if you want to turn to Exodus chapter 2, and we're going to look at our passage, it's actually in Exodus chapter 2 that we were last week, and where we discovered in the beginning part of Exodus chapter 2, we were introduced to God's deliverer, right? This guy that God has slated to be the deliverer of Israel, to lead the people out, and a guy named Moses, right? And he's born under this death sentence that all the Hebrew boys were born under, but he escapes death, and of all things, he gets raised by Pharaoh's daughter, the king's daughter. And he's raised by them. But then we see that Moses has to flee for his life because he kills an Egyptian. One day he sees an Egyptian and he's beating one of the Hebrew slaves, and Moses remembers that he's a Hebrew, and he wants to take up the plight of his people, and he murders this Egyptian, and Pharaoh finds out and wants to kill him. So Moses has to flee far away, flees to this country of Midian. And this is where we find Moses, when our passage opens today, that he's in this far-off land of Midian where he's now married and he starts a family. And we just left off with that where he had this son, right? And this stranger in a strange land. Well, Moses is in Midian some 40 years. Moses went to Midian, he was 40 years old, and he's going to be in hiding or being prepared by God for some 40 years. And sometime in that 40 years, we're now taken back. So it's like how these movies kind of go from scene to scene. And now Exodus takes us back to the people of Israel, back in Egypt. And we see what's happening while Moses is away in Midian. So that's kind of where we pick up this morning. And I want to read our text again, even though we just read it. I want to read it so that we can have it fresh in our mind of this end of Exodus chapter 2 and what's happening here with the children of Israel in Egypt. It says, during those many days, during this 40 years that Moses was gone, the king of Egypt died. The people of Israel groaned because of their slavery, and they cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning. God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. Now we read that, and you're saying, man, that's kind of a short passage, especially after last week. It was 22 verses was our passage, and it is. It's a lot shorter, our passage this morning. But you know what? Our passage this morning is huge because it's pretty important in the whole picture of Exodus, because this passage this morning serves kind of like a hinge where the story of Exodus pivots from hopelessness to hope. You see, before this passage, these first chapter and a half of Exodus, it was all about suffering, right? And death and hardship. And even when we see God, God's kind of working, but he's kind of working behind the scenes. But after this passage, after what we read this morning, the whole story of Exodus changes. And now it's a story that's going to focus on deliverance and rescue and hope. And actually we see God more than ever. We see his power and presence is on display for all to see. So it's kind of this important passage in that way that it pivots the whole story of Exodus to where we've been so far. And as we kind of approach this story, and we read through it, and we read through it pretty quick, one thing is as we look at this passage on a surface level, you know, it can be very easy to get the wrong idea of what this passage is all about. Because when we kind of read this, and we do a quick reading of this passage, it kind of seems to suggest this, and tell me if we kind of read this right in a quick reading, that when we cry out to God, and when we seek him, then we move him into action, right? We finally get his ear. We jog his memory. We get notice. We're understood so that God will now act on our behalf. Do you kind of see that in this passage when we just read through it pretty quick? In fact, that's the way many people look at their relationship with God. And look at the importance of faith in our lives, especially when in regards to coming to him when we're really in need, when we're going through these kinds of trials. We say, man, if I just have enough faith, then God will work. However, before we run with this meaning of the passage, what I want to do is I want to take a step back from our passage this morning. I want to slow us down, because what we need to do this morning, and anytime we look at Scripture, we need to first of all look at it and say, is this really what this passage is saying? Because it's tempting to just say, all right, I got it. Let's run. Let's go. But when we look at the context surrounding this passage, and then we look at actually what it's saying, what we discover is that this passage is saying something different than what on the surface it may appear. You see, when we do this, when we slow down and look at it, we're going to discover that this passage is so much better than what we may think it says. Rather than this passage being some magical formula or these hoops to jump through to get God to work, this passage, when we're going to slow down in just a few minutes, we're going to find it's actually about God revealing who he is. God revealing himself. When we are finally ready to follow him, or when we're finally desperate enough to trust him, we get to know the God who is. So let's just take a few minutes this morning. We're going to dive into this passage, and hopefully I can explain what we're talking about with all of this. So let's give some background to this passage. All right, it's been almost 400 years, right, since the children of Israel have come to Egypt. You remember, they came to Egypt to escape a famine. And when they came to escape the famine, they found Joseph, one of their own, was one of the rulers in Egypt. So he not only rescued them, but he set them up in Egypt. And this family that was 70 people that we find at the beginning is now become this great nation, and they live in the best part of Egypt. And they have the good life. In fact, they're experiencing the blessed life. And it's interesting because they could have gone back to God's promised land for them at any point after this famine was done, yet they haven't. It's been almost 400 years. Do you know what that says to me? They're comfortable. They're pretty happy being in Egypt, rather than being where God has for them. So they're there, and they're in Egypt. And it's been some 400 years, or almost 400 years. Anyway, and as they're at this almost 400 years, as the book of Exodus opens, we see that a new pharaoh, or a new king over Egypt, comes to power. And this king has no regard for who Joseph was way back when, or what he did. All he sees is that there's this people group living in his country that keeps growing and growing and growing, and he sees them as a threat. So what he decides to do is he decides to oppress them. First of all, by making them slaves, and second of all, by enforcing genocide against them, killing all of the baby boys that are born. And he puts this over the people. So the people of Israel, these Hebrews, now are an oppressed people group. And that's kind of where we open what's happening, right? And it's into this kind of setting that Moses is born. Moses was born under this genocide order, yet God rescued him. And at present now, Moses again is in Midian to escape this Pharaoh who did all of this and now wants to kill him. And this oppression, it's been going on under this Pharaoh for at least 40 years, right? Because it happened before Moses was born. Moses was 40 when he went to Midian. So it's at least 40 years, probably much longer than 40 years, maybe 60, 70 years this has been going on. Imagine that. You're facing oppression. You're facing hardship. You're facing difficult times. Sometimes we say, man, how long is this going to go on? I've been dealing with this problem or this issue that just seems to keep coming, and it's been a year. Imagine 40 years, 50 years, and it just never seems to end. And we're starting to get a picture for how the Israelites are feeling right now. And then something happens at the beginning of our passage. That Pharaoh dies. Now, I want you to put yourself in their position. That Pharaoh dies and a new Pharaoh comes to mind, or comes to power. Now, if I'm an Israelite, I'm thinking, all right, it's been a great life under all these pharaohs up till now. And just this one Pharaoh, he's been awful. And he's done all this stuff. But now he's finally gone. A new day has dawned, right? Things are going to get better. I mean, this new guy who comes in, he could like us, and then all this stuff's going to stop, and we're going to go back to the good life again, right? And you kind of have that hope. We have that hope every time, we have elected officials, and they have the end of their term, and we're like, oh, man, we get a change. This is going to be a good thing, or it's going to be a bad thing. But so they're sitting here thinking, wow, this could be a good thing because things have been bad for so long, so we can only go up. Unfortunately, that's not the case, right? Because they're still in slavery. So imagine this. Imagine their frustration. Imagine how it's wearing on them over and over again. So our passage says that when that Pharaoh dies, the people groan because of their slavery. Now, this idea of groaning, okay, the word for this that means groaning, or is translated groaning for us, is kind of like this, almost a reaction, not a response. Like it's unconscious of how it's going. And it's not just, Actually, the word also used for this word groan is sigh. In fact, some translations said that the children of Israel sigh because of their slavery. And you're like, sigh? What does that mean? Well, think about this. Think about you're going through something, right? And the hits just keep coming. And you're just like, man, every time I try to get out, things just keep happening, and they keep coming on me, and I can never get ahead. And if just one more thing happens, I've just had it, right? And then all of a sudden, things are starting to go right, and then the thing happens again. And you just go, oh, right? So that's a sigh, or that's this kind of groan. It's almost like this reaction to it. It's just saying, oh, man. And then it says things kind of get worse for them. Things don't improve, and it says that they cry out for rescue. So now they're getting vocal about it. And the children of Israel are now vocal, and they're saying, come on, man. Something's got to change. We need help here. Doesn't anybody see us? Doesn't the government see that we could be useful or all this? But the idea here with all of this groaning and crying out is they're still doing it, trying to get through it themselves. In fact, we kind of know that they're trying to get through it themselves because of chapter 2 of Exodus. Do you remember when last week we're looking at it and Moses killed this Egyptian who was beating the Hebrew slave? Moses sees that and he's like, my people need help. So he kills this Egyptian. And he thinks nobody sees it until the next day. There's these 2 Hebrew guys and they're having a fight. And Moses is like, why are they fighting? Come on, we should be together. We should be unified. So he goes in and he tries to break up the fight and he goes, why are you hitting this guy? And instead of giving him an answer, here's what he says in verse 14. He says, he answered Moses and said, who made you a prince and judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed this Egyptian? Here we have Moses, God's man, the guy that God has to deliver the people. And he's trying to do something good for his people, right? He's trying to help them, and that help is utterly rejected, isn't it? They're like, who are you? I don't want you. We got this, basically. Have you ever been there? Have you ever been there where you're going through issues and you're going through trials and you have all these things coming on you and you kind of are just like, all right, I can get through this. I got this. And you're like, if I just kind of keep faithful and keep going, and we're going to get through this. And we bear down. Have you ever been there? And then stuff still doesn't start to change, and you're just like, oh, I got to grip my teeth more now, man. I'm going to face it, and I'm going to get it. And you start to do that, and you're trying to get through it all yourself and trying to endure in your own strength, and it's still not working. And maybe you even go to God, but you go to God to bargain with God. You know how you bargain with God? And you say, all right, well, maybe God can help me. So God, I need your help. So I'll get this part of it, and I'll take care of this, and I know where I'm going and everything, but I just need you to help with this. So you just do this to kind of supplement me. Have you ever bargained with God like that? So we ask for his help, but it's very specific help when we don't want anything. Until finally you reach rock bottom. Usually what happens when we try to do things in our own strength and try to get through things in our own strength, and we can't, we get exasperated, don't we? And have you ever been to that point where you finally hit rock bottom, and you're just like, I can't do this anymore. You know what? I've had it. All right. And in desperation, we cry out to God, and we say, God, you know what? Whatever you want to do, fine. Just help. And we lift that up to God. Have you ever been there? That's where the children of Israel here are in verse 23. That's the setting. This isn't some great, courageous faith that they have here. Okay? Again, when we read it as a quick reading, we're like, yes, they cried out to God in faith, and they had this faith, and they said, God, we trust in you. And then God says, all right, because you trusted me, I better work. That's not what's happening here, is it? I mean, it's hardly a place of strength or influence, especially over God. Their faith isn't courageous here. It's desperate. Their faith is desperate. They're at the end of themselves. They have nothing. This isn't something we want to emulate in that sense, that we want to be in that kind of place with God and just be like, oh, I can't do anything. I'm to the end of myself. And to be frail like that. So if we can understand that's the place that the Israelites are here. See, that's the setting. That's the context with which we learn about God here and what he does. That it's not God just responding to acts of great faith like he's obligated, like they did something great. You know, the passage, it isn't showing that God is now finally ready to care for the Israelites. He's finally ready to listen to them or to act on their behalf. Rather, the whole thrust of this passage and where we are is that God's people are now in a place where they're finally ready to trust God. And that's the important point about this passage. And it's through that lens now, when we look at the next 2 verses where it talks about what God does, that we can understand it. It's in the lens or the vein of us being able to trust God. And this makes these next two verses not a response or actions of God based on any great deeds or great faith of his people, of the Israelites or even of us, but rather what we see in these last two verses are a revealing of God's character, a revealing of his care despite frailty of the Israelites and frailty of us. Yet God, in his compassion for us and in his love for us, says, all right, now you're finally ready to see who I really am for you. And that's what this passage is getting at. So what this does is it gives us a picture of who God is for us today. And what this means is that no matter what we may be facing in our lives, or how overwhelmed we feel, or how alone we may feel, we can always come to God. We can always trust in him. Because God's faithful. Again, the whole theme of Exodus is following a faithful God. And here God says, I'm faithful. In fact, what we find here are a few ways that God is faithful and that he is always like this. In fact, what we discover is that we can come to God, we can trust in him because he's always, first of all, in verse 24, we find that God is always aware. Do you know that God is always aware? Now, the words used here in verse 24 says that God heard them. God heard the groaning of his people. Now, don't think that it said that God heard them like God didn't hear them before. Like God wasn't listening and all of a sudden God was like, what? Somebody say something? Sometimes we think that. God hears everything. God knows everything. God is always listening. And he's always aware of what's going on in and around us and in and around everything. In fact, the psalmist alludes to this in Psalm chapter 139. It says this, O Lord, you've searched me and you known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up, you discern my thoughts from afar. You search out my path and my lying down and are acquainted with all my ways. And listen to this. Even before a word is on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. God hears us even before we say anything. So you don't think he's listening? You see, God was aware of his people, the Israelites. He was aware of their hardships that they were facing and the slavery and that it was wearing on them. And he's aware of what we're facing in life, and he's aware of what we will face in life. In fact, again, it says even before a word is on our lips, he's aware of what we're going through. He doesn't need us to tell him what we're going through. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't tell him. We shouldn't go to him and share what we're going through because that helps us process it. It helps us come through us and we could say, all right, this is where I need to rely on God. God, I'm dealing with this. But God always hears and is always aware of everything that has happened, is happening, and will happening to everyone, everywhere. So just in these words, that God heard, it's saying this, that God is aware, he is always aware. You see, what this means for us is we don't have to suffer in silence because God hears. How many times have you ever felt like you're suffering in silence? God doesn't know. God doesn't care. God doesn't hear me. Yes, he does. God hears us every time we call out to him, even before it's on our lips. And not only is God aware that we find here, and he's one that always hears us when we call, but we can also trust him because of something else. You see, it says that God not only heard, but he remembered. Or another way we can understand that is God is always ready to act. You see in verse 24, it says that God remembered them. He remembered his covenant, right, to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob, this covenant that he had made. This doesn't mean, when we hear the word remember, what do we think of? Well, you forgot something, so you need to remember it. And I don't know about you, but the older I get, the more things I seem to forget. And when we hear the word remember, we always kind of put it in that way. Well, we didn't know something, and now we need to know something. We need to be reminded of it. That's not the meaning of the word remembered here. See, again, some of these words in Hebrew have a wider range of meaning. And the idea of remembered here, when you remember something, is that you're called to action, like to obey, or you're ready to act upon something that you already know. And that's what it means here, to remember. God never forgets. It's not like God's like, oh yeah, I was going to do that. Oh, that's right. Yeah, the whole Jesus thing. It's not like God forgot about that stuff. He's got it all, and he remembers it all. So it has this idea that he's ready to act or bring something up for action. And think about this, because the Israelites, they forgot a lot of things during this 400 plus years. I mean, it was over 400 years since God had given this promise to Abraham, okay, their ancestor. And they had probably heard about it, but they didn't have like things written down about all this greatness and what God had promised and everything like this. I don't know about you, but some of my ancestors I know about, but I can only go back maybe about 70 years, 75 years of remembering about my ancestors or learning about them and remembered things that they did. This is 400 years. So it's not that God forgets, it's that the people forgot. But that God says, no, I always remember. In fact, I remember the covenant I made with Abraham. And the covenant that continued to Isaac and then Jacob, who was called Israel, so it continues to the whole nation. And do you remember the covenant God gave to Abraham? It's interesting because it was a one-way covenant. It was a one-way deal. In fact, when God promised Abraham, and he says, you know what, I'm going to make out of you a great nation. Your descendants will outnumber the stars in the sky. And I will give you land. I will place you in land I'm going to give you. And I will make you a blessing, and all the world will be blessed through you. Because Jesus is going to come through him. When God gave that promise to Abraham, it wasn't because of your great faith, I'll do this. Or because you deserve it. Because you just really came through for me, I'm going to do this for you. Or God didn't say, I'm going to do this for you as long as you keep, as long as you, keep really committed to me. That's not this covenant. This covenant God made with Abraham out of his goodness and grace. And it was a one-way covenant that God says, no, I keep this covenant. In fact, through the life of Abraham, when we went through Genesis, we saw where Abraham doubted and when he sinned and fell. We saw it with Isaac. We saw in Jacob, where lie, thief, and steal and all of these things, right, that they're doing. And all of this failure. Yet, God remembers his covenant. He remembers to say, these are my people and this is what I'm working through them. Despite their frailty. Despite their not being able to always be perfect, I'm going to be perfect for them. Isn't that cool? That's what it's saying when God remembered. So it's this idea of grace, that God in his grace, and he's revealing that. And in fact, when it comes to us today, God is faithful to his promise for us today, isn't he? I mean, he always remembers for us, those who come to faith in him and a new life in him through Jesus Christ, right? God has a covenant with us, and he says, I will never leave you or forsake you. Isn't that what Jesus says? And lo, I am with you always. In fact, I'm going to start a work in you, and I'm going to complete it. I'm going to continually work in you. In fact, nothing and no one will be able to pluck you out of my hand. You are mine, and you will always be mine, and I will always love you, even when we fail. God remembers that, and he acts upon that so that he continually shows his goodness to us. There are some things, though, that God doesn't remember in this sense, that he doesn't act, that he chooses not to act upon. Do you know that? So when it talks about remembering, in fact, here's one from Isaiah. Here's what Isaiah says. Actually, God says in Isaiah, he says, I am he who blots out your transgressions for my own sake, and I will not remember your sins. Does God know every time we sin? Yep. Does God know every sin I ever committed? Yep. But he doesn't remember it. Or he chooses not to act on my sin. And what's acting on sin? To punish my sin. Because that deserves death. But see, he's already acted upon it. in Jesus. My sin is covered by Jesus. So even if I'm to sin later today, God doesn't say, oops, you gotta die again, because Jesus already did it. So you see, God's remembrance is an act of his grace for us. God will never forget. He's always faithful and ready to act according to his promise, according to his grace, and according to his love for us. So we have that God's aware and God is ready to act. And relating to God's readiness to act also has to do with the way that he sees. The way that he sees us and sees what's happening around us. In fact, what we discover here in the next verse, it talks about, and God saw them, right? Well, we can trust God with anything because he always sees us, or he always has a plan. You see, when it talks about God having a vision or seeing what's going on, and it says that God saw the people of Israel, it's that God saw the plan that he had for the people of Israel. God sees everything. We kind of saw that in Psalm 139, that God sees everything. It's not like God was looking somewhere else and he's like, what, something happened over there? Or he sees it out of the corner of his eye. Oh, I missed it. Got to hit rewind. I don't want to miss that, He sees it all. He sees everything that happens to every person at all times. It's part of his character. In fact, when we learn a little bit about the attributes of God, one of my favorite attributes of God to learn about, because it blows my mind, is something that God is eternal, or the eternity of God. And I know I probably talked about this, but what the eternity of God says is that God works in time, but he also acts over time because he's eternal. So he works in this time and place, and he sees events happening in time and space as if they're happening right now. But God also can get out of time because God created time. So he can be over time. And it says that God can see and act in all places, in all times, and see it as all happening. The writer of Isaiah says this about God, and God saying this, declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient times, things not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will accomplish all my purpose. God sees the beginning, the middle, and the end. He sees it all. Picture the people of Israel. What are they seeing? They're seeing the oppression they're under right now. When we're going through things in life, what do we see? We see what's in front of us. Do you know why? Because we live in this time and place. We live in this place where time we're under it, right? So we see what's happening to us, and we're just like, where's God? Why isn't God doing anything? But we need to remember that God sees. And God sees, and he's over, and he sees the beginning, the middle, the end. He sees what happened to us, and he still loves us. He sees what's happening to us, and he says, just wait. Wait till you see what's going to happen. Wait till you see what I'm going to work and how I'm going to accomplish this plan. So God's reminding the people and saying, God saw the people of Israel. Or he's saying, no, don't worry. I have a plan. And this plan is going to be accomplished. Right? Just as Isaiah said, I will accomplish my purpose. So God sees it all. He sees his people from beginning to end. In fact, he saw it all. He saw, when he looked at the Israelites going through their suffering, you know what he saw? He saw the covenant that he gave with Abraham, as if he was just giving it to Abraham, and he's reminded of that covenant. And he says, yes, that's why I'm acting. He sees them in Egypt suffering. He sees them, though, in the same vein of being led out of Egypt and into his promised land. You know what he sees? He sees his people and Jesus coming to pay the penalty of sin once and for all and be the ultimate sacrifice. And you know what else he sees for his people, Israel? He sees setting them up again as a nation in the end time. And he says, this is the beginning from the end. So yes, I see you, but I have a plan. And I'm taking you there. It's bigger than just what we're facing right there. God says, I see it. Rest. And when we trust and we understand that God sees it, we can rest in him, can't we? We can say, all right, well, if God sees this, then yeah, what I'm going through right now, he sees how I'm getting through it then. He sees how he's going to lead me out of this or lead me through this to accomplish his plan for me. And I'll continue to work. And so when we understand that God has a plan, he's got a plan for me, he's got a plan for you. And he sees our past, our present, our future, and he's working that plan beyond what we may see so that we can rest in him. So God's aware, he's ready to act, and he has a plan. But there's one more thing that this passage talks about right at the end. Not only did he see his people Israel, it said God knew. I love that ending right there, that God knew. You see, what that means is that we can trust God through anything because he always cares for us. He always cares for us. God is always caring for us. In fact, these two simple words, God knew or God knows. There's some words of comfort, aren't they? I mean, have you ever been to a time where you're just going through it and you just feel all alone? I think back, maybe it's when you lost your first love and you're just like, that's not right. That's the worst thing that ever happened. Or you take a test and you fail it even though you studied. Or you're trying to do something right and yet people don't understand that and they're doing things and attacking you because of it. And you're like, but I'm trying to help. I'm trying to do the right thing and people don't understand. This isn't fair. Have you ever been there? And you go to another person, you're just like, I don't understand it. It's not fair. And that person puts their arm around you and they look at you with those eyes because they've been there before and they just lean over. And while you're in all of this being overwhelmed in this state, they just whisper in your ear, I know. Trust me, I know. Have you ever had somebody do that to you? And all of a sudden, you're like, man, somebody gets it. Somebody's been there. Somebody knows and understands what I'm going through, and they care. And they care enough to say, you're going to make it. And it's just communicated in those words. I know. Just as it says with God. He knew. So that God can offer these words of comfort to say, no, I care. I care right where you are. And that's what God's saying. He's saying, I care for my people. I care for this nation, Israel, who I've given this promise to. I know your suffering. I know your pain. I know your frustration and your fear. But I'm here with you, and I'm here for you through it. Jesus says that with us. In fact, even through this kind of oppression, when Jesus came and walked this earth, he met with God's people, Israel, right? The Jewish people. And they're still going under oppression. They're under oppression of the Roman Empire at this time, And they're getting taxed, all over the place. And they're poor and they don't know where a lot of them are so poor they don't know where their next meal's coming from. And they're just like, what are we going to do? And Jesus comes to them and says, don't be anxious. I know. In fact, here's what he says in Matthew chapter 6. And he's talking to them about their needs. And he says, and why are you anxious about clothing? About what you're going to wear. Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. They do nothing to make themselves beautiful. Yet, I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. And he's basically saying, God made that, right? But if God so clothes the grass of the field, which today is alive and tomorrow is thrown into the oven and is forgotten, right? Will he not much more clothe you, O you of little faith? You see, Jesus is saying, man, God knows. I mean, God knows about the plants and makes them beautiful, even though they're going to die soon. And they're going to be gone. He still makes sure they have everything they need. Don't you think God's going to do that for us? See, God knew. And God knows. He cares for us more than we can ever imagine. And that's what this passage is saying. In fact, here's basically in a nutshell what God is saying through this. God's got us. He's saying to the Israelites, all right, you're crying out to me. Guess what? God's got you. God has all of this. And he says, I'm going to tell you who I am. Now, what we're going to find next week is he takes that to the next level and says, now you really want to know who I am? I'm going to show you. And he comes to Moses and shares with Moses who he is. But for now, these Israelites, they're hurting, right? They're fearful. They're feeling abandoned. And God comes to them and reminds them in this passage. And he reminds them of his attention, right? He says, I heard you. Or, I'm aware. He says, and I support you. I remembered. I'm ready to act. right when I need to act. And he reminds them of their purpose, right? He says, I see you. I've got a plan, though. Rest in me. And then he reminds of his love, and he says, I care, or I know. I've got it. I've got this. And that he's for us. You see, God is faithful and loving for us. But often we don't discover that until we're at that point of desperation, until we're at that point where we're to the end of ourselves. And we can hit rock bottom, and through a series of frustrating circumstances that we're trying to fight against, or we can hit that rock bottom by just being desperate and saying, who am I that I could ever take care of this when I have God? And I want to trust him. God hears, he remembers, he sees, and he knows. He knows us individually and intimately so that we're never alone, we're never abandoned, we're never without hope. It's the same love that he has for us that sends Jesus, right? To do for us what we could never do for ourselves. And it says, for God so loved the world. Remember that verse in John? For God so loved the world. And you're like, yes, Jesus came for the whole world. Yes, he did. Jesus came for the whole world to pay the penalty of sin for everybody who places their faith in him. But you know who that includes? Individuals. You see, Jesus came personally for us personally. Guess what? Jesus came for the whole world. And since I'm part of the world, Jesus came for me, Mark. Jesus came for you, Tom. For you, Kim. For you, Cliff. Jesus came for us. And Jesus, and God loves us, and he knows us, and he came for us. Individually as well. Because he knows our name. Do you know that? God is so intimately cares for us that he not only knows what we're going through, but he knows, and he says, you know what? Whatever you're going through, Rob, whatever you're going through, I've got you because I love you, Rob. And God knows our name. He knows what's on our heart. And before we even can speak it, he knows it. And he cares. And he says, I'm ready to act. And trust me, I will. Because I see it and I have a plan. Because of my care for you.